Now let's have a look on the key challenges that you as a project manager might face and how to overcome them when dealing with the scope control and validating the scope. Scope control ensures that the project remains in line with the approved scope baseline. These common challenges, including the scope creep, which is the uncontrolled expansion of the project. Also, you have the stakeholder conflicts as one of these key challenges. And the stakeholder conflicts, it's mainly when there's a disagreement over scope changes, also alignment issue where the project is deviating from the business objective. So managing scope in the project is one of the most critical responsibility of a project manager. And without having an effective cost control, scope control, the projects can suffer from cost overruns, missed deadlines, and misalignment with the strategic goals. This session will focus on the most common challenges and how to overcome them. And to start first with the scope creep. We've discussed many times what is scope creep. Again, let's say that the scope creep occurs when there is an additional work is introduced without a proper approval and without a proper, let's say, assessment and documentation. And we talked also about the scope of the causes of the scope creep, including the unclear requirements, the stakeholder influence, where there's a large state changes requested by the executives or customers without understanding the consequences of these changes in the middle of the project or without following a formal process for managing these changes where you have a lack of change control. So again, scope creep is a common challenge where an extra work gets added into the project without official approval, without let's say official assessment, and without official documentation. This can lead again to budget overruns, resource strains, timeline delays. Recognizing these causes early allows for a better prevention strategies. Now let's see some of these strategies to avoid the scope creep. Preventing scope creep requires a proactive planning and strong governance. By having a clear scope definition, an effective change control process, project managers can ensure that all work remains with the, let's say, within the approved boundaries. To take it here and more, let's say, in a steps way, we say that again, when you start working with a project, ensure that you define a clear scope statement to ensure that all of the work documented in the scope management plan. And in case if there is any requested changes, ensure that you follow change control process, which must go through the change control board. Remember that you need to assess, you and the team assess the impact of these changes, ensure that these changes are aligned with the project objectives, and then submitting these changes to the CCB or change control board. The third strategy here is to use progress elaboration, the progressive elaboration and rolling wave planning. That will do when you clarify unclear requirements early. So when there is a new requirements that you don't have any clarity on, so you use this progressive elaboration or rolling wave to gather more in-depth details about these requirements when these requirements times comes into an implementation. The fourth important strategy here is to engage the stakeholder throughout the process to reduce the late stage changes. Now let's talk about managing the scope related conflicts. As we've discussed many times that these conflicts in terms of the scope, it arises due the let's say different stakeholder expectation and priorities. You might also some of these conflicts in terms of budget constraints that affecting the scope decisions and lack of clarity in scope documentation. And the resolution to these challenges, so to these conflicts, it's by using a conflict resolution techniques, PMI. If you recall when we say that to go for collaborative decision making, let's say, and ensuring that all of these decisions are made win-to-win situation where it serves the project purpose and the project objectives and goals. Also, the next strategy here for to resolve these conflicts by holding a structured stakeholder meetings to ensure the alignment of your stakeholders with the expectation, setting a realistic expectation with the stakeholders is very important as well. Also, refer to the one of these strategies is to follow back to, let's say, or to review the project charter and the business case for guidance to understand the main purpose of that project. So these scope conflicts can be avoided when multiple stakeholders have different priorities. You, as a project manager, is essential to align the expectations, establish a transparent communication, and resolve conflicts based on the project objectives. Maintaining the alignment with business objectives as one of these important concepts when you are dealing with, let's say, scope changes or scope control issues. Projects should do not only stay within the scope itself, but also aligns with business priorities. If changes do not add a measurable business value, they shouldn't be, let's say, considered. So, you as a project manager ensure that the project delivers a value which aligns with the business goals. Also, avoiding any scope changes that might, let's say, change the alignment of these business values. Using the business case documentation as a reference point for the scope decision. So you remember all of these requirements when you initiated the business case, where you have aligned all of these requirements or the idea of the project with the overall project objectives and the organizational project goals. So ensure to, if you have any thoughts on the business case, in case if there's any changes into the scope, ensure to go back to the business case to, let's say, as a reference point in case if that you decided to do any scope changes that misalign the project goals with the organization objectives. The role of the change control in scope management. So change control, let's say process and group or the ccb, that only is necessary for, let's say, approving the changes and implementing these changes, also assessing these changes. And the key components of change control here includes the change control or the change control board or the CCB, which are the decision-making body for approving or rejecting the changes. You have also the change request itself or the change request process, which is a formal documentation of the change request. And that change request has to highlight all of the, let's say, the impact, the level of, let's say, on changes on the, let's say, in terms of the budget, in terms of the timeline, in terms of adding risks. So this is what the change request should contain. Also, the authority of approving these changes. Also, finally, the key component of having a change control is the impact analysis when evaluating the effects of the changes on scope, schedule, and cost. Again, the impact analysis should be always on sometime or sometimes depend on the organization that you work for. Include the impact analysis as part of the change control or the change request documentation. So again, change management plays a crucial role in scope control by ensuring that every requested changes, let's say, go through an impact analysis and formal approval. And this will help you prevent unnecessary deviation from the scope baseline and avoiding you, let's say, from having a scope creep and ensure that you have an efficient scope control. Let's take an example here. Let's say there is this a healthcare project team that receives a request to add an additional reporting feature in the system, and the change is submitted through the change request process. And after that, the CCB or the change control board review the change, and based on that, they approve it without, let's say, additional funding, because you and the team has assessed that change might add a value to the project without, let's say, compromising the project constraints. Again, talking about the AVM, which is the Earned Value Management to monitor the scope performance. We talked about how AVM integrates the scope, the schedule, and cost performance indicators. And we talked about the key scope related metrics, including the planned value, which is the budgeted work at a given point. We talked also about the earned value or the EV, which is the actual work were completed. We also talked about the schedule and cost performance indexes, the SPI and the CPI metrics to detect any scope issues and to realign your project with the scope baseline or the schedule baseline or the cost baseline. So again, AVM provides the quantifiable way to track the scope completion and detect any deviations early. And by measuring the relationships or the relationship between the planned and actual progress, project managers can identify any scope related risks before they escalate. Documentation tools for the scope control. Scope control documentation ensures, let's say, the transparency and accountability. And these tools and documentation includes the scope baseline. If you recall, when we were gathering the requirements and we established this scope baseline, which includes the approved scope, the WBS dictionary as well, and the list of deliverables. Next, we have the requirements traceability matrix, which can be an important, let's say, reference to understand who has requested what, which tracks the scope requirements to completion. Again, the work breakdown structure or WBS, which defines the project work in a structured format. So again, a well-documented scope management practices reducing, or it helps reducing the misunderstanding and scope conflicts by clearly defining what is included and what is excluded at each of these projects. Let's now have a look in one of these case studies and let's say handling the scope management in a telecom project. Let's say in a scenario where a telecom providing or provider has or was planning to launch a new 5G network infrastructure. Let's say in terms of the plan, the telecom has planned that, and let's say and agreed with the stakeholders on the implementation. And midway of that project, an executive leadership has proposed an additional feature that might add an additional value to the project or to the usage of this 5G network. Again, so the action you as a project manager has to take is using a strict scope control mechanism, the CCB or the change control process, also understanding the impact of these changes and calculating the AVM since you are in the midway of the project. So your project is in the execution phase. Now you have to calculate the AVM to understand, like let's say, in case of this any change, how it would impact the earned value management. So the project manager prevented the budget overruns and ensured the delivery within the schedule. And the key lessons learned here is by having this case study is defining a change control process is helpful to prevent unnecessary scope expansion. Also, the AVM or the end value management helps you as a project manager to track the scope completion and manage any the expectations. Remember that the stakeholder communication is a key in scope related decisions. And to summarize our session on scope control challenges and how to overcome them as a project manager, we talked about the scope creep, which is the most common challenges, and how to, let's say, to control it with a structured process. Also, we talked about the conflict resolution and stakeholder engagement to prevent dispute over the scope changes. What else we have covered? Also, the earned value management or the AVM. We again has gone through the AVM and documentation tools to enhance the scope tracking Finally, we talked about the alignment with the business objectives to let's say to the importance of aligning the project with the business objectives to ensure the project success and achieving, let's say, the organizational success.